Daniel and the lion's den has got to be one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It is probably the most memorable one. You've likely heard it referenced a couple of times throughout your life as an example of courage in the face of danger, of God's deliverance when it seems like there's no way out. And while this story kind of stands on its own, it's important to note how it fits into the rest of the book of Daniel. As you recall, we last left Daniel under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. But we've now transitioned from the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire. And King Darius is the new king, the new villain, as it were, but you can kind of tell he has a different relationship with Daniel. He has a little soft spot in his heart for Daniel. See, Daniel was favored in the court by this king, but he was still an outsider, a Jewish exile, and so the fact that he had some position of power within the court was rare, and quite frankly, threatening to the Persian nationals. They did not like that this strange person with his different and unfamiliar customs had such leverage, and so they plotted against him. They knew that Daniel was faithful to his God, so they tricked the king into passing a law that made it illegal for anyone to pray to anyone other than the king. And King Darius was pretty arrogant. He was easily swayed by his constituents, and he was fond of their flattery and figured, if nothing else, that this law would be pretty good for his ego, making it a law that everyone had to worship and pray to him. Why not? And the consequences were also set. You would be thrown into a lion's den. However, in spite of this law passing, Daniel knowingly breaks it. He breaks the law and continues praying to God. He does it openly, with his windows open and everything. And so the conspirators who had planned this whole thing wait for the right moment, and they pounce. They catch Daniel praying to God, and they turn him in to the king. And the king has no choice but to follow through with the punishment. Now, there's a small detail here that I want to point out, because when they seal that stone to the lion's den with the sign of the state, this very same thing happens in Matthew 27. The rock that's used to seal Jesus' tomb also has the seal of the emperor on it. And in both cases, in Daniel's case and in Jesus' case, they were being put to death in defiance of the empire, because their faith posed a threat to the power of the empire and the emperor. And in both of those stories, those seals are broken by the power of God. Daniel's deliverance from the lions and Jesus' deliverance from death break that symbol of the state on the stones, as if to say, the power of God is greater than the power of any human ruler or empire. That, after all, is one of the main themes of Daniel. Daniel is this lowly Jewish exile who, with his faith and courage, stand up to an arrogant king. And through his faithfulness, he proves that the power of God is greater than the power of any king or empire. And the story behind the story, if you remember, we talked about Daniel is the story, and the story behind that story is that community of people who gathered around a campfire and told stories of Daniel. Their homeland had been overtaken by the military and political power of a foreign king who forced them to worship Greek gods. And so they were thrown into a lion's den, unjustly punished and imprisoned for their faith. And they retold these stories of Daniel, identifying with that spirit of resistance in their trials faced by their hero. They were putting their trust in the stories of a God whose power was greater than that of any human ruler. And these themes from Daniel have been called upon throughout history for all people dealing with an arrogant ruler or unjust laws. Daniel was a role model for people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., who confronted the injustice of the law with their civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. Gandhi was most known for leading the Indian independence movement, but he also spent time as a civil rights activist in South Africa. And he referred to Daniel as one of the greatest passive resistors. Alluding to the way Daniel prayed with his windows open even after the law forbidding it had passed, Gandhi told South African Indians to sit with their doors flung open and tell South African authorities that whatever laws they passed were not for them unless those laws were from God. And in that South African prison, for one engaged in nonviolent resistance to unjust laws, the book of Daniel offered great solace and meaning for Gandhi. Now, Daniel was also a favorite book among civil rights activists. Martin Luther King Jr. refers to the book of Daniel in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And he talks about the higher morality we are called to live by as Christians. Sometimes, King argued, our faith requires us to stand up against unjust leaders and laws. He writes, this civil disobedience was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar, because a higher moral law was involved. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions before submitting to certain unjust laws of the empire. King criticized those devoted to law and order over justice, especially the white churches who supported desegregation in those days simply because it was the law. Now, we have all learned the value of obedience from our parents and our teachers, and even here at church. We've been taught to obey the rules and listen to those in power. That to be good, faithful Christians means being obedient. Well, Daniel offers a slightly different take. Because let's face it, throughout history, the rules and laws have not always been right or just. Sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they need to change. People of color, women, anyone who lives under oppression knows what it is like to have to choose between living under unjust laws or being thrown into a lion's den. And in those cases, choosing the lion's den, choosing disobedience, is a good and faithful response. Disobedience to human laws is holy when it is obedience to God's higher laws. In your life today, you might experience the injustice of laws and leaders. Your boss or someone who has authority over you might tell you to do something that you know is wrong. Or your peers might try to influence you to act against your better judgment. Or someone will treat you unfairly and you will be tempted to strike back. In those moments, turn to this story in Daniel. And notice, Daniel did not lash out against his conspirators. He didn't attack the king. He just kept praying. He disobeyed the law because he was holding firm to his principles. And yes, he was thrown into a lion's den because of it, which isn't awesome, I grant you. I would love to pretend and be able to tell you that following God will keep us out of lions' dens, but it doesn't. Following God can be scary and sometimes does have real consequences. Going against your boss's instructions might get you fired. Going against your peers might mean losing some friends. Living your faith sometimes means swallowing your pride or going against the grain, forging a new trail. But through it all, God promises to be with us in the lion's den. As Martin Luther King Jr. writes, when our most tireless efforts fail to stop the surging sweep of some monster of oppression, we need to know there is a God in this universe with matchless strength. When we are staggered by the chilly winds of adversity and battered by the raging storms of disappointment, we need to know that there is someone who loves us, who really cares, who understands. And in the words of the book of Daniel, God is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. For he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So you, in whatever lion's den you might be facing, take heart. In the lion's den, God is able to deliver you. In the lion's den, God is moving to empower you. In the lion's den, God is with you every step you take.